The first leaf fell on a Tuesday. It drifted from the old sugar maple standing guard beside the gravel road, twirling lazily through the crisp September air like a tiny copper coin tossed from the sky. It landed on the hood of the dusty blue Subaru that was making its slow, careful way up the winding mountain pass. And there it rested, delicate and perfectly formed. Its edges curled slightly inward, as though it too were preparing for a long nap. Inside the car, Margaret Ellison didn't notice the leaf at all. She was too busy gripping the steering wheel with both hands, her knuckles pale against the leather, her eyes fixed on the narrow ribbon of road ahead as it twisted through corridors of towering spruce and pine. The trees pressed close on either side, their dark green branches interlocking overhead like the vaulted ceiling of some ancient, living cathedral. Shafts of pale golden sunlight filtered through the canopy, dancing across the windshield in shifting patterns that made the road seem to ripple and breathe. Margaret had been driving for nearly 4 hours now, ever since she'd left the flat, gray sprawl of the city behind and turned onto the smaller highways that wound their way deeper and deeper into the mountains. She had left before dawn, while the sky was still the color of a bruised plum, and the streetlights were just beginning to flicker off one by one. She had packed the car the night before, loading it with a careful precision that would have surprised anyone who knew her normally scattered approach to most things. 2 suitcases, 1 box of kitchen supplies, a tote bag overflowing with skeins of yarn in every color she could imagine: deep burgundy, forest green, cream, honey gold, soft gray, the pale blue of a winter sky just before snow, and her knitting needles. Circular needles in bamboo and metal, double-pointed needles in various sizes, a crochet hook for emergencies, stitch markers, a row counter, a small pair of scissors with a bird on the handle. Everything she needed, everything that mattered. Behind her, in the back seat, a large cardboard box sat wedged between the suitcases. It contained the pieces of her life that she had decided were worth carrying with her: photographs in frames, a handful of books, a ceramic mug that her best friend Caroline had made in a pottery class years ago, a small potted succulent that had somehow survived the neglect of the past several months. The rest of it, the apartment, the furniture, the accumulated debris of 12 years of living in one place, could wait, could be dealt with later, or not at all. She found, somewhat to her surprise, that she didn't much care. The GPS on her phone had lost signal about 20 minutes ago, but that was fine. She had printed directions too, old-fashioned and reliable, folded into a neat square that now sat on the passenger seat beside a half-empty travel mug of tea that had gone cold an hour ago. According to the directions, she was close now. Another mile, maybe 2, and then a left turn onto an even narrower road, really more of a dirt track. The listing had warned, and then half a mile more until she reached the cabin. The cabin. Just thinking those two words made something loosen slightly in Margaret's chest, like a knot that had been pulled tight for so long that her muscles had forgotten any other way of being. The cabin. Hers for the next 3 months, maybe longer, rented at a price so reasonable that she had initially suspected a scam. But the listing had been legitimate. The photos beautiful in an understated way that suggested the owner had no interest in exaggeration. A small wooden cabin, built sometime in the 1940s, sitting on 5 acres of mountain forest. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a kitchen with an old cast iron stove, a living room with a stone fireplace, a covered porch that looked out over a valley thick with trees. No television, no Wi-Fi unless you drove to the general store 3 miles down the road. Cell phone service was spotty at best. Perfect, Margaret had thought the moment she'd seen the listing. Perfect, perfect, perfect. She had clicked the button to reserve it before she'd even finished reading the description. That had been 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks that had felt more like 3 years, each day dragging past with the sluggish reluctance of something that knows its ending. 3 weeks of packing, of sorting, of making phone calls and sending emails, and having conversations that left her feeling hollowed out and light, like a bird that had been picked clean of its feathers. 3 weeks of people asking her if she was sure, telling her she was being impulsive, warning her that running away never solved anything. She wasn't running away, she wanted to tell them. She was running toward. There was a difference. She could feel it in her bones, in the deep, tired ache that had taken up residence in her body sometime in the past year and refused to leave. She wasn't fleeing something. She was answering something, a pull, a tug, a quiet voice that had been whispering to her in the small hours of the night for months now, saying the same words over and over again like a lullaby. Rest, just for a little while, rest. The road curved sharply to the right, and Margaret slowed the car to a crawl, leaning forward to peer through the windshield. And there it was, the left turn, a narrow gap in the trees marked by a weathered wooden post with a faded number carved into it. She turned carefully, the car's tires crunching over gravel and then dirt, and the trees closed in behind her like a curtain being drawn across a stage. The dirt track was rougher than she'd expected, rutted and uneven, strewn with small stones and the occasional fallen branch. The Subaru lurched and bounced over the irregular surface, and Margaret braced one hand against the door to steady herself. Through the gaps in the trees, she could catch glimpses of the mountainside falling away below, steep slopes covered in a patchwork of evergreen and deciduous trees, the deciduous ones just beginning to turn, their leaves shifting from green to gold, to amber to deep, burnished red. The sky above was a clear, impossible blue, the kind of blue that only existed in autumn, crisp and deep, and infinitely far away. The track climbed for a while, and then leveled out, winding through a relatively flat stretch of forest where the trees grew taller and more widely spaced, their trunks thick with age. Sunlight poured through the gaps in the canopy, illuminating patches of forest floor in warm, shifting pools of gold. Margaret could see ferns, their fronds just starting to yellow with the season, and clumps of late-blooming wildflowers, asters in pale purple and white. A few stubborn goldenrod stems still holding their color. The air that seeped in through the car's slightly cracked window was cool and clean, and smelled of pine needles and damp earth, and something else, something sweet and faintly spicy that she couldn't quite identify. But that made her think of warm kitchens and wool blankets and evenings that stretched on for hours. And then the trees parted, just slightly, just enough, and Margaret saw the cabin. She stopped the car. She sat there for a long moment, her hands still on the wheel, her eyes taking in the scene before her with the slow, careful attention of someone who has been hungry for a very long time and is finally being offered food. The cabin was smaller than she had expected, and somehow exactly the right size. It sat in a small clearing at the edge of a gentle slope, its wooden walls the color of dark honey, weathered to a soft, silvery gray in places where the sun and rain had worked their slow alchemy over the decades. The roof was steeply pitched and covered in dark shingles, and a thin curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney into the still air. That was strange, Margaret thought dimly, since she was the one who was supposed to be arriving. But the thought drifted away before she could hold on to it. The porch stretched across the front of the cabin, its floor painted a faded green, its roof supported by simple wooden posts. 2 wooden rocking chairs sat side by side on the porch, facing outward toward the valley, and between them stood a small table with a single lantern sitting on it. Behind the cabin, the mountain rose in a gentle, forested curve. In front of it, the land fell away in a series of gradual terraces, thick with trees, their canopy spreading out below like a vast, undulating carpet of green and gold and red. Beyond the trees, far in the distance, more mountains rose against the sky, their peaks hazy and blue with distance, their slopes blending into one another until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the next began. The light was extraordinarily soft and golden and thick, the light of late afternoon in autumn, the kind of light that made everything look as though it had been painted by someone who wanted to remember it exactly as it was. Margaret turned off the engine. The silence that rushed in to fill the space where the engine's hum had been was so complete, so total, that it felt almost physical, a weight pressing against her eardrums, a presence rather than an absence. No traffic, no sirens, no distant rumble of the highway or hum of the HVAC system or chatter of voices from the apartment next door. Just the wind moving through the trees with a sound like a long, slow exhalation. Just the occasional call of a bird, bright and clear and solitary. Just the creak of the rocking chairs on the porch, moving gently in a breeze that Margaret couldn't feel from inside the car. She opened the door and stepped out. The air hit her like a wave. Cool, yes, cooler than she had expected. Cool enough that she was glad she'd worn her thick cardigan, but also incredibly clean. So clean that it almost hurt to breathe, like drinking ice water after months of nothing but tepid tea. She stood there by the car, one hand still resting on the open door, and breathed in, and breathed out, and breathed in again, and felt something inside her shift, almost imperceptibly, like a single stone turning over in a stream bed. A bird called from somewhere high in the trees, a clear, three-note song that sounded like a question. Another bird answered from farther away, the same 3 notes, but slightly lower, as though offering a response. Then silence again, broken only by the wind. Margaret walked to the back of the car and opened the hatch. She stood there for a moment, looking at the jumble of bags and boxes, and realized that she had no particular urgency to unload them. They would keep. The cabin would keep. Everything would keep. For the first time in longer than she could remember, there was nothing that needed to be done right now. Nothing pressing or urgent or demanding her attention. The realization was so unfamiliar that it felt almost alien, like wearing someone else's skin. She reached into the back seat and pulled out the tote bag of yarn instead, slinging it over her shoulder. Then she took her cardigan from where she'd tossed it on the passenger seat and wrapped it more tightly around herself. She left the suitcases, the box, the cold tea in its travel mug. She left the car door standing open. She walked up the short path of flat stones that led from the dirt track to the porch, climbed the 2 steps, and settled into the nearest rocking chair. The chair accepted her weight with a low, comfortable groan, rocking back slightly, and then settling into a gentle, rhythmic motion. Margaret leaned back and let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for months, maybe years. The valley spread out before her, vast and still and luminous, with that extraordinary autumn light. The mountains in the distance seemed to pulse gently, their blue shadows deepening and lightening as thin clouds drifted across the sun. She reached into the tote bag and pulled out a skein of yarn, soft, chunky wool in a deep burgundy color that looked almost black in this light, and a pair of circular knitting needles. She didn't have a project in mind. She didn't need one. Sometimes the act of knitting was enough, the slide of the needle through the loop, the gentle tug of the yarn, the way each stitch settled into place with a small, satisfying precision that was like setting one foot in front of the other on a long, quiet walk. Cast on 30 stitches, 40, 50. Her hands knew what to do even when her mind was elsewhere, had known since she was 12 years old, and her grandmother had sat beside her on a similar porch, in a different place, in a different life, guiding her fingers through the motions for the first time. Knit, purl, knit, purl. The simplest pattern in the world, a rectangle of garter stitch that could become a scarf or a blanket or nothing at all. It didn't matter. What mattered was the rhythm, the repetition, the way the burgundy yarn moved through her fingers like a slow, warm river. The sun moved lower in the sky. The light shifted from gold to amber to a deep, honeyed bronze. The shadows of the trees lengthened, creeping across the clearing like dark water, rising slowly around the base of the cabin. The temperature dropped, and Margaret pulled her cardigan closer, but she didn't go inside. Not yet. She wasn't ready for walls and ceilings. Even the walls and ceiling of a cabin she had traveled so far to reach. She wanted to sit here for a little longer, in this particular chair, on this particular porch, with this particular view stretching out before her like a promise. The birds had gone quiet now, replaced by the softer sounds of evening, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the distant murmur of a stream that she couldn't see, but could sense somewhere below the slope, the occasional crack of a branch settling in the cooling air. The wind had died down, and the rocking chair had stilled, and the silence was so deep and so complete that Margaret could hear her own heartbeat, steady and slow, and the soft whisper of her breath, and the tiny rhythmic click of the knitting needles as they moved through the yarn. Click, slide, pull, click, slide, pull. A stitch was born. A row grew. The burgundy fabric curled gently in her lap, warm from her hands and from the last of the sunlight. The first stars appeared not all at once, but one by one, as though the sky were slowly remembering that it was supposed to be dark. They were faint at first, easily mistaken for imperfections in the atmosphere, but they grew steadily brighter and more numerous as the last ribbons of color faded from the western sky. The mountains, which had been blue all afternoon, turned first to indigo, and then to a deep, velvety black that seemed to swallow the horizon whole. The trees below became a single, undifferentiated mass of darkness, and the clearing around the cabin felt smaller now, more enclosed, as though the forest had drawn closer during the transition from day to night. Margaret finally set down her knitting. Her fingers were stiff from the cool air, and the fabric in her lap had grown to perhaps 8 inches in length, a small, rumpled rectangle of burgundy wool that she looked at with something approaching affection. She tucked it carefully into the tote bag, winding the yarn around the skein to keep it from tangling, and stood up. Her legs were stiff too, and her back ached slightly from the rocking chair. But the aches felt good somehow. Earned, the kind of aches that came from stillness rather than stress. She walked to the car and retrieved the box of kitchen supplies and one of the suitcases, leaving the rest for tomorrow. The porch light came on automatically when she stepped onto the first stair, a warm, yellow glow that made the clearing feel suddenly intimate and safe, like a small island of light in the vast darkness of the mountain night. The cabin door was unlocked, as the listing had promised. Margaret turned the handle and stepped inside. The interior was exactly as the photos had shown, and yet somehow more real, more present, more saturated with the particular quality of a space that had been lived in and loved over many years. The living room was to the left, small and square, with wide plank pine floors and walls of the same dark honey wood as the exterior. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel wide and rough-hewn, its hearth swept clean. A fire had been laid there, newspaper, kindling, larger logs arranged in a careful pyramid. And Margaret realized with a start that this must have been the source of the smoke she'd seen from the road. Someone had been here recently. The owner, perhaps, or a caretaker. They had prepared the cabin for her arrival, lit a fire that had since burned down to embers, and then left. The thought should have troubled her, perhaps, but it didn't. Instead, it made her feel tended to in a way that was unexpectedly moving, as though someone had reached through time and distance to place a gentle hand on her shoulder and say, "Welcome. You're here. You can rest now." To the right of the front door was the kitchen, separated from the living room by a long wooden counter. It was small but well equipped, with the old cast iron stove standing against one wall and a small refrigerator humming quietly in the corner. A window above the sink looked out into the darkness, but Margaret knew that in the morning it would frame a view of the trees and the sky and the slow, golden unfolding of a mountain dawn. The counter was bare, except for a wooden cutting board. A ceramic bowl filled with a few late apples, small and slightly imperfect. Their skins, a mottled red and green, and a folded piece of paper. Margaret set down her suitcase and picked up the paper. It was handwritten, the letters slanted and slightly uneven in an older person's hand. "Welcome to the cabin. There's firewood in the shed out back, and the staples in the kitchen should get you through a few days. The general store is 3 miles down the main road. They have most things you'll need, and Helen, who runs it, makes the best pie you'll ever eat. The water comes from a spring, so it might taste different from what you're used to. The stove takes a little while to heat up, but once it does, it holds the warmth beautifully. There are extra blankets in the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. Take care of yourself, Aliner." Margaret read the note twice, then folded it and slipped it into the pocket of her cardigan. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, holding the note against her chest, and felt her eyes sting with tears that she didn't quite understand. It was just a note, just practical information from a landlord to a tenant. But something about it, the extra blankets, the mention of the pie, the last 4 words, so simple and so specific, cracked something open inside her that she had been holding shut for a very long time. She didn't cry, not quite, but she stood there in the dark kitchen, breathing slowly, letting the feeling move through her like whether moving across a landscape. And then she put the note away and reached for the matches on the counter and knelt in front of the fireplace. The embers from the earlier fire were still faintly warm. Margaret added crumpled newspaper and kindling, struck a match, and watched as the small flame caught and grew, licking at the dry wood with increasing confidence. She sat back on her heels and tended the fire as it grew, adding larger pieces as the kindling burned down, adjusting the logs with a brass-handled poker that hung on a hook beside the hearth. The fire was mesmerizing. She had forgotten how mesmerizing, having lived for years in apartments with radiators and central heating, where warmth was something that happened invisibly and without effort. Here, warmth was something you created, something you participated in. It required attention and patience, and a willingness to sit with uncertainty as the flames flickered and caught and grew. There was a lesson in that, Margaret thought, though she was too tired to articulate what it was. When the fire was burning steadily, filling the room with a warm orange glow and the clean, resinous smell of burning pine, Margaret stood and carried her suitcase to the bedroom. It was a small room, barely big enough for the queen-sized bed and the cedar chest at its foot, but the bed looked enormous and inviting, its mattress covered in a patchwork quilt that seemed to contain every color of the autumn forest outside, deep reds and burnt oranges and golden yellows and rich browns, all pieced together in a pattern that was irregular and yet somehow perfectly balanced. Margaret ran her fingers over the quilt's surface, feeling the small, even stitches beneath her fingertips, and thought of the hands that had made it. How many hours had those hands spent bending over this fabric, choosing each piece, placing each stitch? How much patience and care had gone into something that was, ultimately, just a covering for a bed. But it wasn't just a covering for a bed, of course. It was a gift of time, a gift of attention, a gift of the kind of sustained, quiet effort that the world didn't often reward, but that nevertheless persisted, generation after generation, in the making of things that were meant to be used and touched and lived with. Margaret opened the cedar chest and found the extra blankets, just as Alina had promised. They were stacked neatly inside 2 wool blankets in muted plaids, 1 cotton blanket in a soft cream color, and a thick, hand-knitted afghan in shades of gray and white that made her think of snow clouds gathering over a mountain. She lifted the afghan out and held it up, examining the stitch pattern, a combination of cables and seed stitch that was complex and beautiful and deeply comforting all at once. She folded it carefully and laid it across the foot of the bed on top of the quilt. She unpacked her suitcase with the same slow, unhurried attention she had brought to everything since arriving. She hung her clothes in the small closet, flannel shirts, thick sweaters, leggings, wool socks. She placed her books on the nightstand, 3 novels she'd been meaning to read for months, a volume of poetry, a field guide to the birds of North America that she'd bought on a whim at a used bookstore 2 weeks ago. She set her grandmother's knitting needles on top of the books, the old bamboo ones with the slightly bent tips and the worn, smooth finish that came from decades of use. By the time she had finished, the fire in the living room had warmed the cabin to a comfortable temperature, and the darkness outside the windows had deepened to an absolute, impenetrable black. Margaret stood in the middle of the bedroom and listened to the silence of the cabin, the silence of the mountain, the silence that was not really silence at all, but a vast, complex tapestry of small sounds woven together so seamlessly that they became a single, continuous hush. The wind in the trees, the creak of the cabin settling, the faint pop and hiss of the fire, the distant, rhythmic murmur of the stream. She changed into pajamas, soft flannel pants, and a loose cotton top, and padded barefoot to the kitchen. She filled a kettle with water from the tap and set it on the stove's burner, lighting it with a match and watching the blue flame flare to life beneath the kettle's base. While she waited for the water to boil, she opened the cardboard box of kitchen supplies she'd brought and unpacked it methodically. A teapot, a selection of teas, a jar of honey, a small bag of coffee grounds, a few basic pantry items. She found a mug in one of the kitchen cabinets, a thick, heavy ceramic mug in a deep forest green that felt perfect in her hand, and dropped a chamomile tea bag into it. The kettle began to whistle, a thin, high sound that cut through the silence like a small, clear bell. Margaret poured the hot water over the tea bag and watched it steep, the water turning a pale, golden amber. She added a spoonful of honey and stirred, then carried the mug back to the living room and settled into the large armchair that sat angled toward the fireplace. The chair was upholstered in a worn brown leather that creaked softly when she sat down, and it had wide, padded arms that were exactly the right height for resting a mug, or, she suspected, a ball of yarn. She sat there for a long time, drinking her tea and watching the fire. The flames danced and shifted, casting moving shadows across the walls and ceiling, transforming the small room into a warm, flickering cavern of light. The tea was gentle and soothing, the chamomile softening the edges of her tiredness, the honey adding a sweetness that lingered on her tongue. Outside, the wind had picked up again, and she could hear it moving through the trees with a sound like a long, slow breath, rising and falling, rising and falling. A rhythm that matched the rhythm of her own breathing. She thought about the past year, as she had been doing almost constantly for the past 12 months. But the thoughts felt different here. In the city, they had been sharp and urgent, cutting into her sleep and her waking hours with equal efficiency. Here, in the warmth of the cabin, with the fire burning low and the tea growing cold in her hands, the thoughts were softer, rounder. They drifted through her mind like leaves on a slow stream, approaching and then receding, touching the shore, and then floating away again. The job that had consumed her for 8 years, that had started as something she loved, and had gradually become something she endured, and then something she resented, and then something that simply was, like a piece of furniture that was too heavy to move and too familiar to throw away. The long hours, the endless meetings, the emails that arrived at all hours of the day and night, the growing sense that she was spending her life on things that didn't matter to her and hadn't mattered to her for a very long time. The breakup, if you could even call it that. Hers and David's had been less a dramatic rupture and more a slow, gradual unraveling, like a sweater that comes apart one stitch at a time until you look down and realize you're holding nothing but a tangle of yarn. They had been together for 5 years, and somewhere in the middle of year 4, they had stopped talking to each other in any real way. Not fighting. Fighting would have required energy they no longer had for each other, but simply coexisting. 2 people sharing an apartment and a life and a bed who had somehow, without anyone noticing, become strangers. The incident, the word she used in her own mind for what had happened in March, though it didn't really capture it. She had been at work, late, as always, the office empty except for her, and the hum of the fluorescent lights, and the blue glow of her computer screen. And she had been typing an email, a perfectly ordinary email about a perfectly ordinary project, when her hands had simply stopped, not because of a decision or a thought or a feeling, but because her body, apparently, had reached some kind of limit that her mind hadn't been consulted about. Her fingers had frozen over the keyboard, and she had sat there, staring at the half-finished sentence on the screen, and realized that she could not remember the last time she had felt rested. Not just not tired, but actually rested in the deep, cellular way that meant your body and your mind were aligned, and at peace and fully, completely present. She couldn't remember. She had searched her memory, digging back through weeks and months, and eventually years, and she had found nothing. Just a long, unbroken chain of tiredness, stretching back so far that it seemed to merge with the texture of her personality itself, as though being tired were simply who she was. She had left the office that night without finishing the email. She had gone home and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and thought, very clearly and very calmly, I have to stop. Not everything, not forever, but this particular way of being alive. I have to stop. It had taken 3 months to make it happen. 3 months of giving notice, of untangling her finances, of having the conversations she needed to have with David, who had been surprised, then sad, then, in the end, almost relieved. A reaction that told Margaret everything she needed to know about the state of their relationship. 3 months of people asking her what she was going to do next, as though the only valid reason to stop doing something was to start doing something else immediately, as though the space between activities were a dangerous void that needed to be filled as quickly as possible. She didn't know what she was going to do next. That was the whole point. She was going to rest. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing embers by the time Margaret finally stirred from the armchair. The warmth in the room had faded slightly, and a coolness was creeping back in around the edges. But the bed would be warm, the quilt, the extra blankets, the Afghan. She washed her mug in the sink, set it to dry on the counter, and walked to the bedroom. She pulled back the quilt and climbed between the sheets. The sheets were soft cotton, slightly cool at first, then rapidly warming from her body heat. She pulled the quilt up over herself, then the cream cotton blanket, then the gray Afghan, building layers of warmth and weight that pressed down on her gently, like a series of slow, firm hugs. She lay on her back and stared at the ceiling, which she could barely see in the darkness, a faint, lighter rectangle above her, featureless and smooth. She could hear the stream more clearly now, or perhaps it was louder at night. It had a particular quality. That sound, not the random splashing of water over rocks, but something more regular, more rhythmic, almost musical. It rose and fell in a pattern that was too complex to predict, but too consistent to be called random. And it wove together with the wind in the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin to form a kind of natural lullaby, a symphony of small sounds that surrounded her on all sides and filled the darkness with a gentle, living presence. Margaret closed her eyes. She didn't fall asleep right away. Her body was tired deeply, bone-achingly tired, but her mind was still active, still turning over thoughts and images and half-formed ideas like a restless animal shifting in its den. She thought about the fire and the tea and the note from Alina. She thought about the patchwork quilt and the hand-knitted Afghan and the hours of careful, patient work they represented. She thought about her grandmother's knitting needles, sitting on the nightstand beside her bed, and about her grandmother herself, long gone now, 15 years, and the afternoons they had spent together on the porch of her grandmother's house in Vermont, knitting and talking and not talking, comfortable in each other's silence in a way that Margaret had never been comfortable with anyone since. Her grandmother had been a knitter, not as a hobby or a pastime, but as a fundamental aspect of who she was, as natural and necessary as breathing. She had knitted through everything, through grief and joy, through illness and health, through the ordinary, unremarkable days that made up most of a life. She had knitted socks and scarves and hats and mittens and sweaters and blankets and afghans, and once, memorably, an entire dress that she wore to her 50th wedding anniversary, a beautiful, intricate thing in deep blue wool that had taken her nearly a year to complete. When Margaret had asked her once why she knitted so much, her grandmother had looked at her with an expression of mild surprise, as though the question didn't quite make sense. "Because it's what I do," she had said. "It's how I think. It's how I feel. It's how I keep the world from getting too loud." Margaret had understood that answer even then, at 12 years old, though she wouldn't have been able to articulate why. She understood it better now, lying in the dark in a mountain cabin, listening to the stream and the wind and the silence, feeling the weight of the blankets pressing her gently into the mattress. The world had gotten loud, so loud that she had lost the ability to hear anything else, the small, quiet sounds that mattered, the ones that lived underneath the noise like fish beneath the surface of a river. She had come here to find them again. Her breathing slowed. Her body grew heavier, sinking into the mattress, into the layers of warmth, into the darkness. The stream murmured. The wind sighed. The cabin creaked once softly, as though settling more deeply into its own rest. Margaret's thoughts grew less distinct, their edges blurring, their shapes dissolving, until they were no longer thoughts at all, but simply colors and sensations drifting through the dark field of her mind, like autumn leaves on still water. She slept. She woke to light, not the abrupt, artificial light of an alarm clock or a phone screen, but a slow, gradual light that seeped through the curtains and filled the room with a pale, cool glow, like being underwater in a very clear lake. Margaret lay still for a moment, disoriented, not immediately remembering where she was. The ceiling was wrong. The light was wrong. The sounds were wrong, or rather, the sounds were right in a way that was unfamiliar. A chorus of bird song and wind, and the distant stream instead of traffic and sirens, and the neighbor's television bleeding through the wall. Then she remembered the cabin, the mountain, the drive, the fire, the knitting on the porch. She let out a long, slow breath and felt a smile spread across her face, a small, private smile that no one else would ever see. She lay in bed for a long time, not sleeping, but not fully awake either, floating in that pleasant, liminal state where the mind is loose and free, and the body is warm and heavy, and the world outside is still more idea than reality. She listened to the birds. There were many of them, their songs overlapping and interweaving in a complex, joyful chorus that rose and fell in waves. She tried to identify individual voices, the bright, fluting notes of a thrush, the rapid, chattering song of a warbler, the deep, resonant call of something larger, perhaps a raven coming from far away. She made a mental note to look them up in the field guide, but lazily, without urgency, knowing that the birds would be there tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. Eventually, reluctantly, she pushed back the blankets and sat up. The air in the bedroom was cool, but not cold, and the pale light coming through the curtains had a golden quality to it that told her the sun had been up for at least an hour. She swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood, stretching her arms above her head, feeling the pleasant ache of muscles that had been thoroughly rested for the first time in she couldn't remember how long. She padded to the window and pulled aside the curtain. The view stole her breath. The valley below the cabin was filled with fog. Not a thin, wispy fog, but a thick, substantial fog that lay in the hollows and depressions of the landscape like pools of white silk, pooling around the bases of the trees and filling the spaces between the ridges until the forest below looked like an archipelago of green islands floating in a white sea. Above the fog, the mountain peaks caught the early morning light and glowed with an almost supernatural brilliance, their slopes covered in a patchwork of autumn color that seemed to shimmer and pulse in the golden light. The sky above was clear and impossibly blue, a blue so deep and so pure that it looked almost purple at the edges, and a few thin clouds drifted across it like wisps of cotton candy. Margaret stood at the window, her hand still holding the curtain, and stared. She had seen photographs of mountain mornings like this. Of course, everyone has, at some point, seen a photograph of a mountain valley filled with fog. But photographs didn't capture the scale of it, the three-dimensionality, the way the fog seemed to breathe and move and have a presence of its own. Photographs didn't capture the smell of the air, cool and damp and faintly sweet, carrying the scent of decaying leaves and pine resin and something else, something wild and clean that had no name. Photographs didn't capture the sound, the muffled, hushed quality of a landscape wrapped in fog, where every noise was softened and rounded and made gentle, as though the fog were a blanket laid over the world to muffle its sharper edges. She stood there for 10 minutes, maybe 15. She didn't count. She simply stood and looked and breathed and let the view fill her up the way a glass fills with water, slowly and completely, until there was no empty space left inside her. Then she dressed warmly in layers as Aliner's note had implicitly suggested. A long-sleeved cotton shirt, a thick wool sweater the color of cream, leggings, wool socks, her sturdy hiking boots, and went to the kitchen to make coffee. The stove took a while, just as the note had warned, but Margaret didn't mind. She stood beside it with her hands wrapped around the empty ceramic mug, watching the blue flame, listening to the gradual, rumbling build of the water heating toward a boil. When it was ready, she poured the water over the coffee grounds in a small ceramic pour-over that she'd found in the cabinet. And the smell that rose up was so rich and so deep and so completely, perfectly right that she closed her eyes and inhaled it like a prayer. She took her coffee to the porch. The rocking chairs were damp with dew, so she stood instead, leaning against one of the porch posts, cradling the warm mug in both hands. The fog was beginning to lift now, thinning and receding, pulling back from the valleys like a tide going out. As it retreated, it revealed more and more of the forest below, first the treetops, dark and rounded, then the trunks, then the forest floor, carpeted in fallen leaves that glowed red and gold in the strengthening light. The effect was like watching a theater curtain rise on an impossibly beautiful set, each moment revealing some new detail that hadn't been visible a moment before. A fallen log draped in moss, a patch of ferns turning yellow, a distant glint of water that must be the stream she could hear. The sun rose higher. The fog continued to lift. The birds continued to sing. And Margaret stood on the porch of the cabin and drank her coffee and felt, with a certainty that settled into her bones like warmth, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. After breakfast, toast with butter, and one of the apples from the ceramic bowl, which was tart and crisp and tasted like autumn distilled into fruit, Margaret unpacked the rest of her things from the car. The second suitcase went into the bedroom. The box of personal items went onto the kitchen counter to be sorted through later. And the rest of the groceries she'd brought went into the cabinets and the refrigerator, which was small but adequate. She arranged the yarn in the living room, placing the tote bag beside the armchair in easy reaching distance, and spent a pleasant few minutes organizing the skeins by color, lining them up on the wide windowsill that looked out toward the valley. Deep burgundy, forest green, cream, honey gold, soft gray, pale blue. 6 colors, like a limited palette for a painting. And already she was thinking about how they might work together, what patterns they might form, what they might become. But not yet. There was no rush. The yarn would wait. Everything would wait. She spent the rest of the morning exploring the property. 5 acres, the listing had said, and she wanted to know all 5 of them, the shape of the land, the location of the trees, the position of the stream she could hear, but hadn't yet seen. She followed a narrow path that led from the back of the cabin through the trees, winding downhill through a dense stand of birches, whose white trunks gleamed in the filtered light like a stand of pale ghosts. The ground beneath her feet was soft with a thick layer of fallen leaves, and her boots made a satisfying, shuffling sound as she walked, like the sound of pages turning in a very large book. She found the stream after about 10 minutes of walking. It was smaller than she'd expected, a narrow ribbon of clear water, no more than 2 feet across, tumbling over a bed of smooth, rounded stones. It ran along the base of a small ravine, its banks thick with moss and ferns and the dried stalks of summer wildflowers. Margaret crouched beside it and watched the water move, entranced by the way it caught the light, shifting from clear to silver to white as it flowed over and around the stones. She cupped her hand and dipped it into the stream. The water was shockingly cold, almost painfully cold, the kind of cold that felt like a gift, like a jolt of pure, elemental life running through her veins. She sat on a large, flat stone beside the stream for a while, doing nothing. Just sitting, just listening to the water and the wind and the birds. Just watching the way the light moved through the trees, creating patterns on the forest floor that shifted and changed from one second to the next. She had forgotten, in the years of living in the city, what it felt like to simply sit and do nothing, to exist in a place without agenda or purpose or deadline, to be a body in a landscape rather than a person in a schedule. It felt strange at first, almost uncomfortable, like wearing clothes that were too loose. But gradually, as the minutes passed, the discomfort faded, replaced by something that was not exactly pleasure and not exactly peace, but something in between, a kind of quiet, open readiness, as though her body and mind were slowly unfurling after being cramped in a too small space for too long. She walked back to the cabin at noon, following the path uphill through the birches. The sun was high now, and the air had warmed considerably, though it still carried that clean, crisp edge that marked it as autumn rather than summer. The cabin looked exactly as she had left it, solid and snug, and reassuringly real against the backdrop of trees. And she felt a small surge of gratitude for it, not just for the cabin itself, but for whatever set of circumstances had led her here, whatever combination of exhaustion and longing and stubbornness had pushed her to click that button on the listing 3 weeks ago. Lunch was simple cheese and crackers and an apple, eaten at the small kitchen table with the window open to let in the breeze. Then Margaret settled into the armchair by the window, pulled the tote bag of yarn closer, and began to knit. She had decided, while sitting by the stream, what she wanted to make. A blanket, not a small decorative throw, but a real blanket, large enough to wrap around herself completely, large enough to cover a bed. A blanket that would take weeks, maybe months to complete, that would require hundreds of hours of careful, sustained attention, that would grow slowly from a few cast-on stitches to a vast, warm expanse of fabric. She had never made anything so ambitious before. Her knitting projects had always been relatively small, scarves and hats, and the occasional pair of mittens. But the idea felt right in a way that she couldn't explain. A blanket was a commitment. A blanket was a statement of intent. A blanket said, "I plan to be here for a while. I plan to stay." She chose the cream yarn first, a soft, chunky merino wool that felt like a cloud in her hands, and a pair of size 10 circular needles. She cast on 200 stitches, counting carefully, placing a stitch marker every 50 to keep track. Then she began to knit, working in a simple stockinette pattern, each row a meditation in repetition. Knit, 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 slide the marker. Knit, 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 slide the marker. Knit, 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 slide the marker. Knit, 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 knit. The cream fabric grew slowly beneath her needles, row by row, each row adding another tiny increment to the whole. The rhythm of the knitting merged with the rhythm of her breathing, which merged with the rhythm of the stream outside and the wind in the trees, until all of it was one continuous, undulating flow, like a single, vast breath moving through the cabin and the forest and the mountain and her. She knitted through the afternoon. The light shifted from the bright gold of midday to the warmer, more amber tone of late afternoon, and the shadows in the room lengthened and deepened. She paused occasionally to drink water or stretch her fingers, or simply to sit and look out the window at the changing colors of the sky. But she always came back to the knitting, drawn to it by something deeper than habit or intention, a pull that she felt in her hands and her chest, and the quiet, attentive part of her mind that the knitting seemed to activate, the part that could think about nothing and everything at the same time. By the time the sun began to set, she had completed perhaps 20 rows, 2 inches of cream-colored fabric that curled gently at the edges, as stockinette tends to do. She examined her work with a critical eye, checking for dropped stitches or uneven tension, and found none. The fabric was smooth and even and regular, each stitch identical to its neighbors, a small testament to the calming effect of the mountain on her normally somewhat anxious mind. She set the knitting aside and built a fire in the fireplace. The process was becoming familiar now, almost ritualistic, and she found that she enjoyed it. The careful arrangement of the wood, the satisfaction of the first small flame catching and spreading, the gradual transformation of the cold, dark hearth into a warm, glowing center of the room. While the fire grew, she heated water on the stove and made tea chamomile again, with honey, and carried it to the porch. The sunset was extraordinary. The sky to the west had turned a deep, saturated orange, shot through with streaks of pink and purple and gold, and the mountains below were silhouetted against it in sharp, dark relief, their outlines as precise as though they had been cut from black paper and pasted against the burning sky. The valley below the cabin was already in shadow, the fog beginning to gather again in the hollows, but the peaks and ridges to the west still caught the last of the light, glowing amber and gold against the darkening sky. Margaret sat in one of the rocking chairs. It had dried off during the afternoon and rocked gently back and forth, watching the colors fade and deepen and slowly, inevitably give way to darkness. The stars appeared one by one, just as they had the night before, and the temperature dropped, and the wind picked up, and the forest below filled with the sounds of evening, the chorus of crickets, the call of an owl, the rustle of nocturnal animals beginning their nightly rounds. She finished her tea and went inside. She knitted for another hour by firelight, adding a few more rows to the cream fabric, then put the knitting away and got ready for bed. She brushed her teeth in the small bathroom. The water from the tap was cold and tasted faintly of minerals, just as Aliner's note had warned. But it was clean and fresh, and she found that she liked it and changed into her flannel pajamas and climbed between the layers of blankets. She lay in the dark and listened to the stream. It seemed louder tonight, or perhaps she was simply more attuned to it, more open to hearing it. Its rhythm was steady and constant, rising and falling in a pattern that was almost, but not quite, predictable, like a heartbeat with its own mysterious logic. She focused on the sound, letting it fill her awareness, letting it push out the last lingering threads of thought and worry and memory, and felt herself sinking slowly, gently, down into sleep the way a leaf sinks through still water without resistance, without effort, simply yielding to the pull of something deeper and quieter and more patient than herself. She slept deeply and dreamlessly, and when she woke the next morning, the first thing she did was smile. The days that followed settled into a rhythm, not a rigid schedule, nothing so structured as that, but a gentle, flowing pattern that rose and fell like the mountain stream, carrying her along without effort or strain. Mornings began early, with the gradual brightening of the light through the bedroom curtains and the slow awakening of the bird chorus outside. Margaret would lie in bed for a while, listening and breathing, letting herself surface from sleep the way a bubble rises through water slowly, without rushing, pausing along the way to linger in that pleasant, half-awake state where the boundaries between dreaming and waking were thin and permeable. Then she would get up, dress in layers, and make coffee on the cast-iron stove, standing in the warm kitchen and watching the steam rise from the pour-over and feeling each morning a small, fresh surge of gratitude for the simple, specific pleasure of a good cup of coffee made in a particular way in a particular place. She would take her coffee to the porch and watch the fog lift from the valley. Each morning the fog was different, thick and billowy one day, thin and wispy the next, sometimes lingering in the hollows until mid-morning, sometimes burning off quickly in the early light. Some mornings the sky was clear and blue, other mornings it was overcast, the clouds hanging low and gray over the mountains, wrapping them in mist so that they looked like the ghosts of mountains, spectral and insubstantial. Every morning was beautiful in its own way, and Margaret made a point of noticing the beauty, of not taking it for granted, of saying to herself, silently, this. Pay attention to this. Remember this. After coffee, she would walk. Sometimes she followed the path through the birches to the stream, sitting on her flat stone and watching the water and listening to the forest wake up around her. Sometimes she wandered farther afield, exploring the 5 acres of the property, and then venturing beyond it, following old logging roads and deer trails deeper into the mountain forest. She discovered a meadow about a quarter mile from the cabin, a small, open space carpeted in wild grass and surrounded on all sides by trees, with a view of the valley that took her breath away every time she emerged from the forest and saw it. She discovered a grove of sugar maples at the top of a small ridge, their leaves so intensely red in the autumn light that they looked like they were on fire. She discovered a fallen tree, enormous and ancient, that had created a small dam in the stream, forming a pool of still, dark water that reflected the sky like a mirror. She carried her field guide with her on these walks, and slowly, day by day, she began to learn the birds. The hermit thrush, with its fluting, ethereal song that sounded like someone playing a glass harmonica in the forest. The black-capped chickadee, with its distinctive 2-note call that sounded like it was saying its own name. The dark-eyed junco, a small, neat bird with a gray head and white outer tail feathers that flashed like tiny flags when it flew. The white-breasted nuthatch, which walked headfirst down tree trunks with a cheerful, slightly absurd determination. She learned their songs and their habits and their preferred habitats, and she found that knowing them changed the quality of her walks. Instead of hearing an undifferentiated chorus of birdsong, she heard individual voices, each one belonging to a specific bird with a specific life, and the forest became richer and more layered and more alive with every walk. Afternoons were for knitting. Margaret would settle into the armchair by the window, or sometimes on the porch if the weather was warm enough, and she would knit for hours at a time. The cream blanket grew steadily, row by row, inch by inch. She developed a pattern for it, not a complex pattern, but something more interesting than plain stockinette. A border of seed stitch along the edges, a panel of cables running down the center, a subtle rhythm of texture that gave the fabric a depth and richness that plain knitting couldn't achieve. She worked slowly and carefully, counting her stitches, checking her pattern, unraveling and reknitting when she made a mistake, refusing to rush or cut corners. Each row was an act of attention, a small offering of time and care to the growing blanket. And she gave each row the same consideration, whether it was the first or the 100th. The cream yarn gave way eventually to the honey gold, and she spent a pleasant afternoon simply thinking about the transition, how to do it, where to do it, whether to make it sharp or gradual. In the end, she chose a gradual transition, working alternating rows of cream and gold for 10 rows, then 2 rows of gold to every one of cream for 10 rows, then 3 to 1, then all gold. The result was a soft, shimmering band of color that shifted from cream to gold like the changing of the light itself. And when she held it up and looked at it in the afternoon sun, she felt a surge of satisfaction so pure and so uncomplicated that it almost made her laugh. Evenings were for fires and tea and more knitting, and for reading, and for simply sitting and being. Margot would build a fire in the hearth and let it fill the room with warmth and light, and she would sit in the armchair with her knitting or her book and listen to the night settle in around the cabin. She read the novels one by one, slowly, savoring them, not rushing to find out what happened next, but enjoying each page for its own sake, the way you enjoy each bite of a good meal. She read the poetry in small doses, a few poems at a time, letting the words and images and rhythms wash over her, and then recede, leaving behind a residue of feeling that she couldn't quite name, but that she recognized as something important. On the 3rd evening, she read a poem that stopped her. It was by Mary Oliver, and it was about the grass growing, and the turtle doing what it does, and the speaker of the poem saying that she didn't know what prayer was, but that she knew how to pay attention. Margot read the poem 3 times, and then she closed the book and sat very still for a long time, and the fire crackled, and the stream murmured, and the wind moved through the trees outside, and she thought about attention, what it meant, what it cost, what it gave, and she understood, in a way she hadn't before, that paying attention was not a passive act, but an active one, a choice you made over and over again, moment by moment, to be present for your own life. She picked up her knitting and paid attention to each stitch, the slide of the needle, the pull of the yarn, the way the loop formed and settled and became part of something larger than itself. She paid attention to the warmth of the fire on her face and the coolness of the air on her neck and the weight of the growing blanket in her lap. She paid attention to the sounds around her, the specific, particular sounds of this specific place at this specific moment. Sounds that would never be repeated in exactly this way again. It was a form of prayer, she realized. Maybe the only form she had. A week passed, then 2 weeks. The autumn deepened. The trees around the cabin changed color with a slow, stately deliberation that Margaret found endlessly fascinating. First, the sugar maples, their leaves turning from green to gold to a deep, blazing red that seemed to come from within, as though the trees were burning with their own inner fire. Then the birches, their leaves shifting to a bright, clear yellow that glowed against their white trunks like lanterns. Then the oaks, more slowly, their leaves darkening to a deep, rich burgundy that reminded Margaret of the yarn she had brought, but not yet used. The evergreens stayed green, of course, the spruces and pines and hemlocks that formed the backbone of the forest, steady and unchanging against the autumn fireworks of the deciduous trees. But even their green seemed to deepen and intensify as the surrounding colors grew more vivid, as though they were responding to the seasonal shift by becoming more themselves. The air grew colder. The mornings were frosty now. The grass and the porch and the roof of the car glittering with a thin layer of ice crystals that caught the early light and sparkled like scattered diamonds. The stream ran a little slower, a little more quietly, as though it too were beginning to settle in for the winter. The birds changed, some left, heading south to warmer climates, their departure marked by the gradual thinning of the morning chorus, while others arrived, migrants from the north, seeking their own winter refuge, bringing new songs and new colors to the forest. Margaret adapted. She added more layers, thermal underwear beneath her clothes, a heavier wool sweater over everything, a thick scarf wound around her neck. She learned to build bigger, longer-lasting fires, selecting the right combination of logs and kindling to keep the cabin warm through the coldest parts of the night. She learned to cook on the cast iron stove, making simple meals that filled the kitchen with warmth and good smells. Soup from dried beans and vegetables, oatmeal with apples and cinnamon, toast with butter and honey, baked potatoes wrapped in foil and nestled in the coals of the fire. She went to the general store for the first time 2 weeks after arriving, driving the 3 miles down the mountain on the dirt road that now felt familiar and almost friendly. Its ruts and bumps no longer alarming, but merely a feature of the landscape, like the rocks in the stream. The general store was exactly what she had hoped it would be: a small wooden building with a screened porch and a hand-painted sign that said Helen's in faded red letters. Inside, it was a treasure trove of necessities and small luxuries: canned goods and dried pasta, and bags of flour and sugar, a small refrigerated section with milk and cheese and eggs, a shelf of books, and another of puzzles. A rack of hand-knitted hats and mittens in bright colors. A glass case filled with pies and cookies and bread, all made by Helen herself. Helen was behind the counter, a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a braid, sharp blue eyes, and a no-nonsense demeanor that concealed what Margaret would gradually discover was a deeply kind and generous heart. She looked at Margaret with frank curiosity when she walked in, asked her a few questions about where she was staying and how long she'd be there, and then, apparently satisfied with the answers, nodded and said, "Well, you'll want the apple pie then. Just came out of the oven this morning." Margaret wanted the apple pie. She wanted it very badly. She bought a slice. Helen cut it from a large, golden-crusted pie and placed it on a small plate and ate it standing at the counter, right there in the store. And it was, as Aliner's note had promised, the best pie she had ever eaten. The crust was flaky and buttery and practically dissolved on her tongue, and the filling was warm and fragrant with cinnamon and nutmeg, and the apples were tender but not mushy, still retaining a slight bite that gave the pie a texture that was both soft and substantial. Margaret closed her eyes while she ate it, and when she opened them, Helen was watching her with an expression of quiet satisfaction, as though this were exactly the reaction she had been hoping for. "I'll take a whole one," Margaret said. "For the cabin." Helen nodded, as though this were the only sensible response. Margaret left the store with the pie, a bag of groceries, and a new pair of wool socks that Helen had talked her into buying. "Your feet get cold up there, I can tell just by looking at you," and drove back up the mountain feeling as though she had just completed some important initiation ritual. She was no longer just a visitor to this place. She was a participant. She had been to Helen's. She had eaten the pie. She had bought the socks. She belonged here, at least a little, at least for now. She thought about Helen on the drive back, and about Aliner, and about the other people who lived in these mountains, scattered across the landscape in small cabins and houses and farms, connected to each other by winding roads and shared knowledge, and the particular kind of community that exists in places where the land is large and the population is small, and people still rely on each other, not out of obligation, but out of simple, practical necessity. She thought about what it would be like to live here year-round, to know these roads in every season, to watch the trees change, and the snow fall, and the spring come, year after year, and to be part of the unbroken continuity of life in a place like this. The thought was tempting, more than tempting. It settled into her mind like a seed falling into soil, and she could feel it taking root, slowly and quietly, in the part of her that was still and attentive and open to possibility. The blanket grew. By the end of the 3rd week, it was perhaps 18 inches wide and 4 feet long, a substantial piece of fabric that draped over the arm of the chair. and pooled on the floor when she set it down. The cream section had given way to the honey gold, and the honey gold had given way to the soft gray. And now she was working on a band of forest green that would eventually transition into the deep burgundy. Each color change was a small ceremony, a moment of pausing, of considering, of making the deliberate choice to move from one thing to the next. She had learned in the weeks of knitting that transitions were the hardest part, not because they were technically difficult, they weren't. Just a matter of introducing a new yarn and working it in, but because they required letting go of something familiar and committing to something new. Each color change was a tiny act of faith, a trust that the new color would work, that the overall pattern would hold, that the beauty of the finished blanket would be worth the uncertainty of the process. She was learning a lot of things from the blanket, she realized. Things that had nothing to do with knitting and everything to do with living. One afternoon, about 3.5 weeks into her stay, Margaret was sitting on the porch knitting when she heard a sound that made her look up from her work. It was a vehicle, the distant, mechanical rumble of an engine coming up the dirt road. She hadn't seen another vehicle since she'd arrived, and the sound was so incongruous in the mountain silence that for a moment she thought she was imagining it. But no, the rumble grew louder, and then a pickup truck appeared around the bend in the road, its dusty red paint almost the same color as the burgundy yarn in her lap. It pulled to a stop in front of the cabin, and a woman climbed out of the driver's side. She was perhaps 70 years old, Margaret guessed, tall and lean, with weathered brown skin and white hair cut short, and bright, dark eyes that took in the cabin and Margaret, and the knitting in her lap with a single, comprehensive glance. She wore jeans and a flannel shirt and boots that looked like they had walked 1,000 miles of mountain trails, and she moved with the easy, confident grace of someone who was completely at home in her body and in the world. "Margaret," she said. "Yes, I'm a leaner. I wanted to come by and see how you were settling in." Margaret set down her knitting and stood, feeling suddenly, inexplicably nervous, like a student being inspected by a teacher. "The cabin is wonderful," she said. "Thank you." The note was, I can't tell you how much I appreciated the note. Alina smiled a warm, crinkling smile that transformed her face, making her look both younger and older at the same time. "I meant what I wrote," she said. "Take care of yourself. That's not just a polite sign-off. That's real advice. The mountain will take care of you if you let it, but you have to let it. You have to stop trying to be in charge of everything." Margaret felt the words land somewhere deep inside her, in the place where the tiredness lived, and she nodded slowly. "I'm working on that," she said. "I can see that." Alina gestured toward the knitting in Margaret's lap. "May eye. Margaret handed her the blanket in progress, and Alina held it up, examining the stitch pattern, the color transitions, the overall quality of the work. Her fingers moved over the fabric with the practiced sensitivity of someone who knew textiles. Margaret could tell immediately that Alina was a knitter, or had been, by the way her hands traced the stitches, reading them the way a musician reads a score. "This is beautiful," Alina said. "Your tension is excellent. And the color transitions, this is your own design." Margaret nodded, feeling a flush of pride that she hadn't expected. "I've never made anything this big before. It felt like the right thing to make, though." "Here, it's the right thing," Alina agreed, handing the blanket back. "A blanket for a mountain cabin. There's something deeply right about that. My mother was a knitter. She made the afghan on the bed, the gray and white one. I've been using it every night," Margaret said. "It's incredible. She made it for my father the winter before he died. He used it every night too, until he didn't need it anymore." Alina said this without sentimentality, simply stating a fact, but there was a warmth in her voice that told Margaret the facts contained depths that weren't immediately visible. "I've kept it all these years. It seemed right to have it here where it would be used." They stood on the porch for a while longer, talking about small things, the weather, the coming winter, the best places to find morel mushrooms in the spring, the family of barred owls that nested in the woods behind the cabin. Alina was a fount of knowledge about the mountain and its inhabitants, both human and otherwise. And Margaret listened with the same attentive, open quality she had been cultivating in her weeks at the cabin, letting the information settle into her without trying to organize or categorize it. Before she left, Alina reached into the truck and pulled out a paper bag, which she handed to Margaret. "From Helen," she said. "She told me she met you. She doesn't give her banana bread to just anyone, so consider yourself honored." Margaret peeked inside the bag and found a loaf of banana bread, still slightly warm, wrapped in a clean cloth. The smell that rose up was so intoxicating, sweet and warm, and faintly tropical that she had to close her eyes for a moment. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in a way that encompassed more than the bread. Alina nodded, climbed back into her truck, and drove away, the red vehicle disappearing around the bend in the road, and the sound of its engine gradually fading, until the silence closed in again, complete and total, and somehow even deeper than before, as though Alina's brief presence had made the quiet more noticeable by contrast. Margaret took the banana bread inside, cut a thick slice, and ate it sitting in the armchair by the fire. It was dense and moist and studded with walnuts, and it was, impossibly, even better than the pie. She ate it slowly, one bite at a time, paying attention to each bite the way she had learned to pay attention to the birds and the trees and the stream and the stitches of her knitting. And she felt something that she had been feeling more and more often in the past weeks. A sense of completeness, of rightness, of being exactly where she was supposed to be doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing. It was not happiness exactly. It was quieter than happiness and more sustainable and more real. It was the feeling of being aligned with the place, with the moment, with herself. It was the feeling that the noise inside her had finally, after months and years of relentless clamor, gone quiet. She picked up her knitting and continued. The fourth week brought the first frost that was more than a light dusting. Margaret woke to a world transformed, every surface white and glittering, the grass a crisp carpet of ice crystals, the porch railing frosted with feathery patterns that looked like miniature ferns. The air inside the cabin was cold, cold enough that she could see her breath when she sat up in bed, and she burrowed deeper into the blankets for a moment before summoning the will to get up and face the day. The fire had burned completely out during the night. She knelt in the hearth and rebuilt it, her fingers clumsy with cold, and it took several attempts before the kindling caught. But when it did, the flames leaped up with an almost aggressive enthusiasm, as though they too were eager to push back the chill. And within an hour, the cabin was warm again, the stone of the fireplace radiating heat in slow, rolling waves. She made coffee and took it to the porch, as she did every morning. But the cold drove her back inside after only a few minutes. She sat by the window instead, watching the frost sparkle in the rising sun, and knit and thought about the winter that was coming. Alina had told her during her visit that winters on the mountain were serious business. Heavy snowfall regularly, temperatures that could drop well below zero. The dirt road became impassable for days at a time, sometimes longer. You needed to be prepared, plenty of firewood, plenty of food, plenty of supplies. Alina had offered to have a load of firewood delivered before the first big snow, an offer that Margaret had accepted gratefully. "Are you planning to stay through the winter?" Alina had asked, and Margaret had hesitated before answering. "I don't know," she had said. And it was true. She didn't know. 3 months had been the original plan, October through December, and then back to the city, back to her life, back to whatever came next. But the idea of leaving in December, just as the mountain was entering its most dramatic and beautiful season, felt increasingly wrong. Like leaving a story in the middle of a chapter, like putting down a book before the ending. She pushed the thought away and focused on her knitting. The forest green section was nearly complete, and the burgundy was waiting, rich and dark and mysterious, like a pool of deep water. She would start the burgundy tomorrow she decided, or the next day. There was no hurry. The blanket would tell her when it was ready for the next transition. The days grew shorter. The sun rose later and set earlier, its arc across the sky shrinking with each passing week, and the quality of the light changed from the bright, clear gold of early autumn to a thinner, paler gold that seemed to come from farther away, as though the sun itself were retreating from the cold. The shadows grew longer and more blue, and the periods of direct sunlight on the cabin grew shorter. The sun dipping below the mountain ridge earlier each afternoon, and leaving the valley in a twilight that lasted for hours. Margaret found that she didn't mind the darkness. On the contrary, she welcomed it. The shorter days meant more time by the fire, more time for knitting, more time for the kind of quiet, interior life that the cabin seemed designed to support. She lit candles in the evenings. She had found a supply of them in a kitchen drawer, plain white pillars that filled the room with a warm, steady glow. And she would sit in their light with her knitting and her thoughts, and the darkness outside the windows would feel not threatening, but protective. A vast, soft blanket wrapped around the cabin and everything in it. She began to sleep more. Not because she was tired, though she was still, in that deep, old way that she was beginning to accept might simply be part of who she was, but because the darkness invited sleep, made it feel natural and right, like a response to the season rather than a failure of stamina. She would go to bed earlier and earlier, sometimes as early as 8 o'clock, climbing between the layers of blankets while the fire was still burning, and letting the warmth and the darkness and the sound of the stream carry her down into sleep like a gentle current. Her dreams changed. In the city, her dreams had been anxious and fragmented, missed appointments, lost keys, doors that wouldn't open, trains that departed without her. Here, her dreams were calmer, more coherent, populated by images from her days. The stream tumbling over stones, the fog lifting from the valley, the red leaves of the sugar maples glowing against a blue sky. She dreamed about her grandmother once, a long, detailed dream in which they sat together on a porch, her grandmother's porch in Vermont. Not this one, and knitted in companionable silence. And her grandmother said, without looking up from her work, "You're doing it right, Margaret. Don't stop." She woke from that dream with tears on her face and a feeling in her chest that was too large and too complex to have a name. And she lay in the dark for a long time afterward, holding the feeling carefully, like a cup filled to the brim with something precious, letting it slowly, slowly seep into her. The wood was delivered on a Tuesday, the same day of the week. Margaret realized, with a small spark of amusement, that the first leaf had fallen from the sugar maple back in the city, what felt like a lifetime ago. A truck much larger than Aliner's came rumbling up the dirt road, driven by a young man with a red beard and a baseball cap, and it dumped a massive pile of split firewood on the flat ground behind the cabin with a thunderous crash that sent a flock of birds erupting from the nearby trees in an explosion of wings and calls. The young man, whose name he told Margaret was Sam, climbed down from the truck and surveyed the woodpile with a critical eye. "Aliner said to tell you to stack it under the lean-to," he said, gesturing toward a small, roofed structure attached to the back of the cabin that Margaret hadn't noticed before. "Keep it dry. Nothing worse than wet wood in January." "January," Margaret repeated. The word sounded foreign and slightly intimidating, like the name of a distant country she had heard about but never visited. "You planning to stay through the winter?" Sam asked, echoing Aliner's question from the week before. "I'm thinking about it," Margaret said. Sam nodded, as though this were a perfectly reasonable answer. "Smart to think about it," he said. "Not smart to decide too fast. Mountain takes some getting used to. But once it gets into you, it's hard to leave." He paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "The wood should last you through March if you're careful. Longer if you keep the stove going during the day instead of just at night." He left, and Margaret spent the rest of the afternoon stacking wood under the lean-to. It was hard, physical work, lifting the split logs, carrying them one or two at a time to the lean-to, stacking them in neat, ordered rows, the bark rough against her hands, the wood heavy and solid and real in a way that her former life in the city had almost never been. She worked slowly, without rushing, pausing frequently to rest and drink water and look at the view of the valley, the mountains, the sky, the trees in their autumn finery. And by the time she was finished, her arms ached and her back ached, and there was a thin sheen of sweat on her forehead despite the cold air. And she felt, paradoxically, more energized than she had in weeks. She went inside and built a fire with some of the wood she just stacked freshly split oak, which burned hot and long, and filled the cabin with a rich, smoky scent that was different from the pine she'd been using. And she sat in the armchair and watched the flames dance and listened to the fire's voice, which was deeper and more resonant than the pine's, a bass note to the pine's tenor. And she thought about what Sam had said. Once it gets into you, it's hard to leave. She looked around the cabin, at the wide plank floors, the stone fireplace, the patchwork quilt on the bed visible through the bedroom door, the growing blanket draped over the arm of her chair, the skeins of yarn lined up on the windowsill like a small, bright rainbow. And she felt the mountain's presence all around her, vast and patient and ancient. And she knew, with the quiet certainty that she had been cultivating since she arrived, that it had already gotten into her, that it had been getting into her from the moment she turned off that first road and onto the dirt track. From the moment she first stepped onto the porch and heard the silence and smelled the air and felt the particular quality of this place settle into her bones, whether she stayed through the winter or not. And she was increasingly certain that she would never be the same person who had driven up this mountain a month ago. That person was gone, dissolved, transformed, like a caterpillar in a cocoon. And the person who was emerging in her place was someone Margaret was still getting to know. Someone quieter, someone more attentive, someone who knew how to build a fire and identify a hermit thrush and knit a blanket from scratch and sit still for hours without feeling guilty or anxious or like she was wasting time. Someone who knew how to rest. The 5th week brought rain. It started gently, a soft, misting rain that drifted down through the trees like a veil, barely wetting the ground. But by the 2nd day, it had intensified to a steady, persistent downpour that drummed against the cabin roof and ran in rivulets down the windows and turned the dirt road into a river of mud. The stream below the cabin swelled, its voice deepening from a murmur to a roar, and the fog descended so thickly that Margaret couldn't see the valley at all. Just a wall of gray-white mist pressing against the windows like a living thing. She didn't mind. The rain made the cabin feel even cozier, even more of a refuge, the warmth of the fire more precious, the weight of the blankets more comforting. She spent the day in her armchair, knitting by firelight, stopping occasionally to listen to the rain and to watch the patterns it made on the window panes, trickling streams and tiny rivers and small, temporary lakes that formed and merged and overflowed and disappeared, only to be replaced by new ones in an endless, self-renewing cycle. The burgundy section of the blanket was progressing beautifully. The deep, rich color was even more striking than she had imagined. A dark wine red that seemed to absorb the firelight and glow with an inner warmth. She had decided to end the blanket with the burgundy, carrying it through to the final edge, where she would bind it off with a band of seed stitch in the cream color, bringing the whole thing full circle, beginning and ending with the same neutral, grounding shade. She thought about that as she knitted, the circularity of it, the way the beginning led to the ending, which led back to the beginning. She thought about the seasons, which did the same thing, cycling from winter to spring to summer to autumn and back to winter again. Each cycle different from the last, but following the same fundamental pattern. She thought about her own life, which had been feeling less and less like a linear progression, and more like a spiral, moving through the same themes and questions and challenges over and over, but each time at a slightly different level, with a slightly different perspective, a little more understanding, a little more grace. The rain fell. The fire burned, the blanket grew, the stream roared, and Margit sat in the warmth of the cabin and knitted and thought and breathed and was, for long stretches of time, simply and completely at peace. On the second evening of the rain, she got up from the armchair and walked to the kitchen and pulled out a pen and a piece of paper. She had brought a small supply of stationery, thinking she might want to write letters, though she hadn't used any of it yet, and sat at the kitchen table and began to write. Not a letter, not exactly. More like a note to herself, a record of this moment, this place, this feeling. She wrote about the rain and the fire and the blanket, and the way the burgundy yarn looked in the firelight. She wrote about the stream and the fog and the birds she had learned to recognize, and the feel of the wool in her hands. She wrote about Alina and Helen and Sam, and the sense of community she was beginning to feel, tenuous but real, like the first green shoots of a plant pushing up through soil. She wrote about her grandmother, and about the dream, and about the feeling that had woken her with tears on her face. And then, at the bottom of the page, she wrote, "I don't know what comes next. For the first time in my life, I don't know what comes next, and I am not afraid." She set down the pen and read the words again, and they were true. She wasn't afraid. The anxiety that had been her constant companion for so long, the low, humming worry about the future, about money, about career, about relationships, about all the things she was supposed to want and be and achieve, had not disappeared entirely, but it had quieted. It was still there somewhere, like a sound heard from very far away, but it no longer filled her awareness, no longer dictated the terms of her inner life. In its place was something else, something she could only describe as trust. Trust in the process. Trust in the unfolding. Trust in the basic, fundamental rightness of being here now, doing this, living this life, one stitch at a time. She folded the note and slipped it into her journal, alongside the note from Alina, and a few pressed leaves she had collected on her walks. A red maple leaf, a yellow birch leaf, a small, perfect oak leaf that had fallen onto the porch one morning like a gift. Then she went back to her chair, picked up her knitting, and continued. The rain ended on the third day, and the world that emerged from the mist was transformed. The air was crystalline, scrubbed clean by the storm, and the colors of the autumn forest seemed to glow with an almost unnatural intensity. The red's redder, the gold's gold, the green's greener, as though the rain had washed away a film that had been dulling them. The mountains stood out against the sky with a sharpness and clarity that was almost startling. Every ridge and ravine and rock face visible in perfect detail. And the sky itself was a blue so deep and so pure that it looked like the sky you see in paintings of the Renaissance. An idealized, impossible blue that couldn't possibly exist in the real world, but somehow did, Margit stood on the porch and stared at the view with the same wonder she had felt on her first morning, a month and a half ago. The wonder hadn't diminished. If anything, it had deepened, grown more nuanced, more textured, as her familiarity with the place increased. She noticed things now that she hadn't noticed before, the way the light fell differently on the north-facing slope than on the south-facing one, the way the fog lingered longer in certain pockets of the valley, the way the colors of the trees varied from one ridge to the next, creating a layered, topographical map of the landscape in red and gold and green. She walked that morning, walked far and long, following the old logging road past the meadow and up the ridge to the grove of sugar maples, which were now at the absolute peak of their color. Every leaf a brilliant, blazing red that seemed to set the air itself on fire. She stood in the middle of the grove and looked up through the canopy at the sky, which was visible through the leaves as a series of small blue fragments, like pieces of a broken mosaic. And she felt the light filtering through the red leaves fall on her face like a warm, gentle rain. And she thought, I am standing in a cathedral made of trees and light and color and air, and it is more beautiful than any building ever built by human hands. She walked back to the cabin slowly, reluctantly, pausing every few steps to look back at the grove, not wanting the experience to end. But it didn't end, not really. The grove would be there tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, at least until the leaves fell. And even then it would still be there, just in a different form, just in its winter shape instead of its autumn one. That was something else she was learning from the mountain. Things didn't end. They changed. They transformed. They became something new. And the new thing was not less than the old thing. It was simply different, with its own beauty and its own meaning and its own reason for being. Back at the cabin, she made lunch and ate it on the porch. She couldn't bear to be inside on such a day, and then settled into the rocking chair with her knitting. The burgundy section was nearly finished now. Just a few more inches to go before she would start the cream border that would complete the blanket. She worked slowly, savoring each stitch, knowing that the end was approaching and wanting to extend the process for as long as possible. Because that was the thing about knitting that non-knitters never understood. The point was not the finished object. The point was the making, the hours of quiet, focused attention, the rhythm of the needles and the yarn, the way each stitch connected to the one before it and the one after it, creating a continuous, unbroken chain of care and intention that was, in its own modest way, a kind of love. The finished blanket would be beautiful and useful and warm, and she would use it and love it. But the real gift of the blanket was not the object itself, but the process of creating it, the hundreds of hours of sitting and breathing and noticing and being present that the blanket had made possible, that the blanket had been the excuse for. Without the blanket, would she have sat in that chair for all those hours? Would she have watched the fire and listened to the rain and noticed the way the light changed from moment to moment? Would she have been as present, as attentive, as completely and unreservedly here? Maybe, maybe not. The blanket had been a vessel, a container, a reason, and she was grateful for it. The last stitches of the blanket were completed on a Sunday evening, 6 weeks after Margot's arrival at the cabin. The fire was burning low and steady in the hearth. A candle flickered on the windowsill beside the line of yarn skeins, most of which were now depleted, or nearly so. Outside, the night was cold and clear, the stars bright and sharp against the dark sky, and the stream had quieted with the dropping temperature, its voice reduced to a low, gentle murmur that was barely audible through the cabin walls. Margot sat in the armchair with the finished blanket spread across her lap. It was large, nearly 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, a substantial, weighty piece of fabric that had taken on a presence of its own over the weeks of its creation. She ran her hands over it, feeling the different textures of the different stitch patterns, the smooth stockinette of the main body, the bumpy richness of the seed stitch border, the raised ridges of the cable panel running down the center. She looked at the colors, the cream fatting into honey gold, fatting into soft gray fatting, into forest green fatting, into deep burgundy, with the cream returning at the edges like a frame around a painting. And she saw, for the first time, that the blanket told a story. The story of an autumn on a mountain. The story of 6 weeks of attention and care and slow, patient work. The story of a woman learning, stitch by stitch, how to rest. She held the blanket up and wrapped it around her shoulders. And it was warm, warm from the fire, warm from her body, warm from the wool itself, which seemed to hold heat the way a stone holds the warmth of the sun after dark. It fit perfectly around her, covering her completely from neck to toe, and she pulled it tighter and leaned back in the chair and closed her eyes. She sat like that for a long time, wrapped in the blanket she had made, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the silence of the mountain. And she felt something that she could only describe as wholeness. Not perfection. There were still rough edges in her life, still questions without answers, still fears and uncertainties that lurked in the corners of her mind. But wholeness, completeness, a sense that all the different parts of herself, the tired part and the hopeful part, the anxious part and the peaceful part, the part that wanted to run away and the part that wanted to stay, had somehow come together and made peace with each other, not by resolving their differences, but by agreeing to coexist, to share the same space, to be part of the same body, the same life, the same story. The fire crackled, the stream murmured, The wind moved through the trees outside with a sound like a long, slow breath. And Margaret, wrapped in her blanket, warm and safe, and at peace, felt her body grow heavy and her mind grow quiet, and the darkness close around her like another blanket, soft and dark and infinitely gentle. She wasn't asleep. Not quite. She was in that state between waking and sleeping, that liminal territory where the boundaries of the self become permeable, and the world dissolves into a warm, formless haze of sensation and feeling. She was aware of the blanket around her, and the fire beside her, and the cabin around her, and the mountain beneath her, and the sky above her. And she was aware of herself in the center of it all, small and still and perfectly content, like a stone at the bottom of a clear, cold stream. She thought one last time about what her grandmother had said in the dream. "You're doing it right, Margaret. Don't stop." She wouldn't stop. She would keep knitting, keep walking, keep paying attention, keep building fires and making tea and watching the fog lift from the valley. Keep listening to the birds and the stream and the wind. Keep learning the names of things and the stories they told. Keep being here now, in this place, in this moment, in this life that she had been given, and that she was finally learning to live. The fire burned lower. The candle guttered and went out. The darkness deepened. And Margaret, wrapped in her blanket in the warm cabin on the side of the mountain, slept. Not the restless, fractured sleep of the city, thin and anxious and full of teeth, but the deep, heavy, dreamless sleep of the mountains, ancient and patient and kind. A sleep that reached all the way down to the roots of things, to the bedrock beneath the soil, to the deep, still center of the earth itself. A sleep that was not an escape from life, but a return to it. A sinking back into the source from which all waking moments drew their energy and their meaning. Outside, the mountain kept its vigil. The stars wheeled slowly overhead. The stream ran on, tireless and eternal. The trees stood in their autumn colors, burning quietly in the dark, and the wind moved through them with a sound like breathing, rising and falling, rising and falling, a rhythm as old as the mountains themselves. And in the morning, the light would come again pale and gold and infinitely precious, and Margaret would wake, and she would make her coffee, and she would sit on the porch, and she would watch the fog lift from the valley, and she would begin again, because that was what you did on a mountain. That was what the mountain taught you if you let it. You began again. Every day, every hour, every moment. You began again and again and again, and each beginning was a gift, and each breath was a prayer, and each stitch was a small act of love, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.